Thanks very much for having me here, and thanks everyone. So I actually learned a lot about compliance and enforcement coming to Warsaw. So what was interesting to me was arriving and walking along the pavements and getting to a tiny street where there are no cars and all the pedestrians stop and the light is red and everyone obeys the light and waits until it's green for 2 minutes and then only walks across, right? So this is like high levels of compliance. But so I was confused about why this was happening, and so I was asking Piotr about why does this take place, and he said it's because you don't see that there's a policeman hiding behind the pillar there, and when you step across he's going to come and give you a fine, right? So the kind of situation that I'm going to be talking about is basically the opposite of this, right? It's kind of trying to understand how minimum wage adjustments take place in an environment with very weak enforcement and higher levels of non-compliance. So actually, I'm talking, combining two pieces of work. The one is just a general descriptive overview of some minimum wage regimes in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's just a kind of background, and then a paper that we're working on which looks specifically at partial minimum wage compliance in South Africa. Okay. So as I said, I start with a regional overview, then some information kind of similar to what Piotr presented, but on a few sub-Saharan African countries on levels of non-compliance. And then this section of a kind of specific paper looking at how wages adjust to the introduction of a minimum wage law. And here we look at the case of the agricultural sector in South Africa, and I'll talk a bit about that when we get there. So the paper itself emanates from two strands of work. The one is, as Piotr was saying, this kind of popularity of looking at impacts of a minimum wage law, and we do the standard thing, and we try to assess how the introduction of minimum wages in South Africa, which are relatively recent, have impacted on some observable characteristics for workers. And then alongside that, we've been doing the same thing of trying to measure levels of compliance with minimum wages across various sectors. So there's different sectoral minimum wages in South Africa. And so the numbers shown previously are kind of tiny compared to what we see. There's kind of average levels of non-compliance around 40% for some sectors in South Africa. So this is a very different picture. But what we're interested in here is how does the wage distribution for covered workers change when you introduce a minimum wage law, especially at the bottom of the distribution. So given that there's weak enforcement, what happens to workers who are being paid below the minimum wage law if the incentives to increase wages are low? Okay, so a bit of background for Sub-Saharan Africa. Like elsewhere in the world, minimum wages are widespread, but there are some big differences, particularly because such a small proportion of the labor force is actually covered by a minimum wage law in most Sub-Saharan African countries. So the number of wage-earning employees is very low. So around 20% of the labor force on average is in some kind of wage employment, and the rest are in kind of self-employed, unpaid family work, and so on. And in addition, you have countries where the minimum wage only applies to the public sector or a specific sector. So here's just some data on, for a selected number of countries, the number of paid employees or percentage of paid employees. And you can see the averages are very low, the highest being South Africa, where that's a kind of comparable number to some European countries. And then here, this just gives you a sense of where the levels of minimum wages are at. So this is, I think, 37 African countries that we plot. On the y-axis is just US dollar purchasing power parity, monthly minimum wages, and then we correlate that with levels of GDP. So that's sort of as you would expect, minimum wage levels rising with level of GDP. And we do this as well for kind of comparable set of countries outside of Sub-Saharan Africa, and we find similar relationship, but kind of stronger relationship between GDP and minimum wage levels. Then one important point to note is the complexity of wage schedules, and this we think has some impact on the levels of compliance, right? So here's the number of wage schedules in a selected subsection of the countries that we look at. And you can see, I mean, on average, 27 different minimum wages that would cut across kind of geographic regions or occupations or sectors, and the highest being South Africa, which has a huge number of variations across and within sectors. So it makes, from all sides, for employers, employees, and inspectors, it makes things very difficult to enforce such a complex schedule. Okay, so what do we know about non-compliance globally? We know that there's a lot of work on minimum wage impacts, but very little work on compliance. But this is kind of slowly changing, so increasingly there's work trying to understand non-compliance and how enforcement works. And it seems that one of the key issues is not a lack of legislation, so you have lots of complicated legislation similar to India, but it's actually a lack of compliance. So in the kind of Indian case, it would be, how do you know that those complex laws are actually biting? And in our case, we suggest that in many cases they're not. So we use the same index of violation to analyze this question, and you can think of it as basically analogous to the FGT class of poverty measures, right, where you have P0, P1, and so on. So here's some estimates for, in the blue, a selection of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in the red, a selection of developing countries outside of Africa. And, I mean, on average, the levels of violation are very high and slightly higher in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is taken from labor force survey data for each of the countries, which is a kind of complex task in itself. But, so those are the basic estimates for the head count of people who earn below the minimum wage, and then V1, which just tells you the depth of non-compliance, and there the comparison across regions is not so different. So when thinking about non-compliance, we've tried to understand it in several dimensions. The one issue is, which this measure captures, is the kind of overall head count and including the depth into your calculation, which is important in the same way that it's important when you're looking at income poverty. The second is that obviously for a firm, the choice isn't just we either comply or we don't comply, right? There's a number of variations that a firm could choose. They could pay some workers at or above the minimum wage and others not. They could pay all their workers or increase all their workers' wages sort of closer to the minimum wage. And linked to, sorry, that should be point 3, linked to that point, the impact of introducing a minimum wage, even when there is high non-compliance, might be to compress the wage distribution, right? So employers actually increase wages even though they don't increase them all the way up to the minimum. And that's essentially what we see in our case study here. So our research question is, given that compliance is not binary and non-compliance can be an equilibrium outcome in certain market structures and given incentives, then we try to develop a theory that produces some outcomes that we can test. So I don't present this here, but we have this in the paper, which is coming out as a Journal of Labour and Development paper. And so what I'll present here is then the empirical work which we use to try and test that model. So we look at changes in the distribution of wages below the minimum wage, and we ask this question: in an environment of weak enforcement, how do employers adjust wages in response to the introduction of a minimum wage law? So this is just to give you some idea of the penalties that are incurred. So this is actually in 2014. So I guess 1 rand you can think of as an equivalent to about 10 rands to $1, around about that level. So you can make a calculation there. But this is 2014, and it's recently been updated, and it wasn't updated from 1997 until 2014. So not adjusted for inflation during that entire period. And even so, this update shows that the fines for violation are relatively small, right? So you get a small fine if you kind of don't have a contract or you are not paying overtime. And then if you're underpaying in minimum wages, you get a fine based on how much you're underpaying. So to look specifically at the work we did, we look at the agricultural sector where minimum wage was introduced in 2003 for the very first time. It was differentiated by urban and rural areas, and those are the levels at which the wage was introduced. And so we do, in a previous paper, the basic analysis, and we find, on average, wages rise. We see and this is the only case we see this in South Africa, a significant decrease in employment as a result of the law, and increased kind of non-wage benefits for workers. So more contract coverage, which was included in the law as being required, and then some changes in hours worked. So the data we use is a kind of standard labor force survey, and we have a number of waves before and a number of waves after the law. And so this includes between 2,000 and 3,300 farm workers in each wave. And then because the wage levels are different in two areas, we kind of treat these separately. And we have two kind of difference in differences specifications that try to measure the impact of the law. So the first one is a very standard kind of Card-and-Kruger style difference in differences estimation, where we try to set up a control group and test what the impact was on farm workers versus a comparable control group that was unaffected by the law. And we can come back to this and talk about it afterwards if anyone is interested. The second one is slightly different, where we tried to make use of some geographical differences in the data, and we construct what we call the wage gap, which is for a specific area called the district council. We construct a kind of pre-law wage gap, so how far below the legislated wage you were, all workers in that district were, and then compare that to outcomes in the post-law period. So this tries to get around some of the obvious problems of having a control group and things like contamination and so on. So I'm just going to show you some of the descriptive results first. This is the V1 measure, so increasing levels of violation here and decreasing levels of violation towards the left-hand axis. And what you can see is that, so 2001, 2002 are the pre-law period, 2003, 2004, 2005 is the post-law period. And you can see kind of quite clearly this big shift to the left, which is kind of like a decrease in the levels of violation. And to note, this is the violation gap. So this is we have a point estimate for each worker, so how far your wage was below the minimum wage. So we see this big shift here and sort of no comparable shift in the control group. We do this again for V2, which just places more weight on the wages that are further away from the minimum wage. And we get a kind of similar story where you see this big bulge towards zero, which is basically a decrease in the depth of violation. So these are just the tables which show you those same figures on average. We can just look at the average shortfall figure, and it sort of seems to be decreasing in the period straight after the law was introduced. And if we do the same thing for the other area, we find a similar decrease. And then, so briefly, the econometric results. This is the first specification, which is basically the treatment versus the control group. So what we're interested in is this difference in differences estimator here. And we see that there's a kind of small decrease in overall levels of violation. And you can actually, in the previous tables, see here, we find kind of slight decreases in the overall number of people who earn below the wage, but the real movement is in the depth. And so this kind of confirms that, where we see when we add controls, an overall decrease in violation after the law was introduced, but kind of larger movements if we take into account how far below workers were from the minimum wage. Our second specification is this kind of wage gap measure, and here we, again, are interested in this estimator, and we can kind of find similar results there, where you see that in districts where, in the pre-law period, the average shortfall was larger, you get this bigger makeup for workers who are being pushed up closer to the law, to the level of the minimum wage. Okay, so some basic takeaways from what we try to do. We see that the fraction of workers below the minimum wage decreases over time, and it seems to be in direct response to the introduction of a minimum wage law. Although absolute and relative levels of non-compliance remain high, employers are obviously choosing not only whether or not to comply, but by how much to comply, suggesting that you can have a range of possible responses depending on the kind of incentives to comply. So obviously we find evidence of kind of partial compliance, workers changing the wage but not all the way up to the minimum. And we try to understand, in some sense, in this paper, what's really going on, but there's definitely a need for more work to understand what are the incentives at play here and why do employers do this. Then kind of some more generalized conclusions. So we know that this phenomenon of non-compliance is widespread, but it's kind of at present relatively under-researched. So things like developing estimates for this violation index globally would be a useful starting point, and that's kind of beginning to take place. And then trying to understand how what some of the drivers of minimum wage violation are is a second point. And on this topic, we are trying to better understand, in particular, how labor inspectors work. So do they inspect large firms versus small firms more often? What is their kind of so-called production function? And how does that impact on whether it's more likely for me as an employer to comply or not? If I'm further away from the labor center, does that make a difference? If I'm in a particular sector, does that make a difference? And so on. So we're trying to do some work on that. But for the sort of standard stuff of what is the impact of the minimum wage, this obviously also matters because it's not necessarily now just about you introduce a minimum wage, everybody complies with what happens to employment. It's also about this interaction between, well, how much do employers actually comply and how that interacts with the other effects that you see. Okay, thank you.